and welcome, belatedly, to a new year at the Oddity Archive, complete with the same old junk. Well, save for one new addition, but that's another topic for another day. Anyway, for this first new regular episode of the new year, I want to test out a potential new concept, tentatively called Archive Revisited, because I'm so creative. And of course, the idea is to revisit stuff that I outright screwed up the first time. You screw everything up! Stuff that I'm better equipped to handle now, as well as those episodes where the information I presented the first time around has since gone outdated. So with that, this, if you will, pilot episode, I want to, perhaps against my better judgment, revolve around easily that one tech episode that has crawled up my ass far more than any other. And again, I could really be asking for it because this was one of the more controversial episodes, and it was also one of the hardest to make the first time around. But anyway, let's take another crack at the much more extreme competitor to Dolby noise reduction, decibel expansion, or DBX. As you can see, I have acquired a second DBX unit, which is this DBX 228, and I think it dates to about 1982. One of the reasons I really started trying to do more maintenance on, if not outright replace the equipment I used in the first 5-ish seasons of Archive, was in part due to the reaction to my initial DBX noise reduction episode. At the time, I was still using my old $90 Newmark turntable that I'd had since college, and had never so much as replaced the stylus or properly adjusted the tracking force in the 10 years that I'd owned it. The reel-to-reel deck I was using was very much on its last legs as well. And then, to add insult to injury, a few months later, I, by some insane stroke of luck, managed to acquire a few of the ultra-rare, legitimately released DBX cassette tapes, which I managed to screw up by running on a cassette deck in need of both an azimuth alignment and especially speed calibration. In the 2-ish years that have passed since the initial DBX episode, while I haven't been able to afford full-fledged audio snob gear, the equipment has been upgraded as follows. While I still have and periodically use my old Newmark, which has since been fixed up a bit, as far as Oddity Archive proper goes, I've gone over to an Audio-Technica AT-LP120 direct drive turntable with a Nagoka MP110H cartridge, aligned and calibrated to the best of my abilities. 2 cassette decks have replaced the old MCS/Technics clone, which died during the making of the Dolby the Hard Way episode. My main playback deck is now a JVC KD A6 direct drive unit. More on that playback stipulation later. My main recording deck is now a TIAC V770. Both decks were cleaned and tuned up to the best of my abilities. The old Roberts reel-to-reel has been replaced by a TIAC A3300SX, which I cleaned out to the best of my abilities, then subsequently had it fully serviced by a professional. The only carryover from the original episode remains my trusty old Sony RCD W500C standalone CD burner, which I, of course, used to capture audio. The format that I took the most heat for the first time around was vinyl, and understandably so. But I think the thing, at least partially, was Techmoan, another channel here on YouTube, and one that I do recommend, had done a video on the line of DBX encoded LPs, which were out from about 1974 to 82. And when I saw that video, I had always known DBX as something that you used on your own recordings, and it didn't seem like anyone had really covered that yet. But in the name of completeness, I wanted to touch on the LPs, so I rounded up a few. And admittedly, it was somewhat perfunctory within the context of my initial take on DBX. I wanted to keep the focus on the recording end of things. But I think the Techmoan video, which was I think 5 or 6 months old at the time, was still so fresh in everyone's mind that everyone just seemed to fixate on the vinyl. So here's the deal. I've taken new passes at all 4 of my DBX encoded LPs, 3 of which I have in at least one other issue and or format. And this is the extreme one, this Loggins and Messina LP. I've got the DBX LP, but I also have one of those half-speed mastered audiophile discs, and yeah, this is the same thing, but this isn't encoded with anything. You don't need any special gear for this one. And then I have just the normal old LP, and I have the original issue circa 1990 CD issue of this one. Now, unfortunately, thanks to the YouTube bots, I'm going to have to keep the audio clips for this segment pretty brief and pretty choppy. So to try and offset this, I will either narrate or annotate any observations and feelings on my part. While I was transferring the DBX encoded discs, I noticed something different from my initial pass. One LP in particular, namely the Police's Zenyatta Mandata, seemed to be a total sonic flatline. In other words, regardless of the levels I set on my CD burner or DBX unit, it seemed to play like a modern, super compressed CD. Read loud. Much more so than my first attempt 2 years ago. Given that this was the last LP in the stack, I started freaking out, thinking my DBX unit had gone crazy. So I went back and redid the first song only of my other 2 pop music LPs. They came out the same way they did during their previous pass. My takeaway from this is that these LPs were just as prone to the usual mishaps that can occur during mastering and or pressing as any other LP, and are sensitive to things like the cartridge on your turntable. As far as my Loggins and Messina and Joan Armatrading discs went, the waveforms proved similar across all pressings and formats. Only the frequency response changed.
And it goes on and on, oh, watching the river run. And we have just begun, watching the river run. And it goes on and on, oh, watching the river run. and it goes on and on, oh, watching the river run. And we have just begun watching the river run.
Down to the ground, down to the ground. You know how it is. Still more crying when you're thinking of your mother's only son. Down to the ground, down to the ground. You know how it is. Still more crying when you're thinking of your mother's only son.
When I did the Ben's Junk installment on the pre-recorded DBX cassettes, I noticed that the stereo image on all my tapes seemed to tilt off in one direction or another, and it was different from tape to tape, and in one case from side to side. But when I took my new passes at these tapes, it came out better than the previous time, but it was still a little droopy, and I have a bit of a theory on this. So when I bypass the encoding, the stereo image seems a bit better. You know, center seems more center, right seems more right, left seems more left. But nonetheless, my guess is that these performances weren't terribly well recorded in the first place. Bear in mind that these are all early digital recordings. We're talking 1979 and 80 here. Also, whoever engineered this line of tapes for DBX had the tough task of getting program material with, I'd imagine, in upwards of an 80 to 90 decibel dynamic range onto an otherwise normal Type 2 cassette. And to make matters worse, DBX tapes clip, distort, a lot more easily and at a much lower point than a so-called standard cassette. These tapes, at their loudest point, peak at about -7 dB. So I'm guessing the quieter parts, which make up the bulk of the material, imagine that, classical, coupled with the not-so-hot original recording, tend to fall below the threshold that the DBX would really latch onto it at, and it kind of skews the final product that much more. Having said all that, these do not sound bad at all, and I'm talking about 90% in theory here. This part went a little crazy for me, so try to stick with me through this intro segment here. My initial intent was to use this TAC V770 deck for the cassette recording tests. The reason being that my usual JVC KD-A6 always records almost exactly about 1% too slow. So if I want to take my recordings to another deck, it needs to be one with a pitch control knob on it so I can speed it back up. And I took that JVC to my old repairman back in Denver, and he advised me to keep it the way it was because the fix not only might not work, but may very well screw up other facets of the deck and ruin an otherwise perfectly good playback deck. As such, I normally only use it for playback. So when I did a battery of tests on the TAC here, every one of them wound up having some degree of a pumping, breathing effect on them, and the lower quality of tape, the worse it got. The TAC records with Dolby HX Pro. Whether you want it or not, you cannot disable it. I have deduced that the Dolby screwed up my test results.
Okay, gang. Head for the car. Speed City, baby.
So, despite the speed issue on the JVC, I just went ahead and did yet another battery of tests on it. Those turned out infinitely better. Last but not least are a battery of tests I did on the reel-to-reel. Now, I know the audio nerds like to argue about the best reel-to-reel tape stock, but here's the deal with me. For what it's worth, I use new old stock polyester-backed Scotch 150. This has less to do with fancy tape stock and more to do with Scotch 150's good survival rate and resilience, and it's still pretty easily obtained. Strange as it sounds, these tests were the easiest ones to do.
And everybody's gotta learn to get along together with no ands and ifs and no buts. And whether don't you know that I tried? Oh, but you've been gone so long that I don't know what I'm gonna do. And everybody's gotta learn to get along together with no ands and ifs and no buts. And whether don't you know that I tried? Oh, but you've been gone so long that I don't know what I'm gonna do. And everybody's gotta learn to get along together with no ands and ifs and no buts. And whether don't you know that I tried? Oh, but you've been gone so long that I don't know what I'm gonna do.
I don't like your criticism, be it right or be it wrong, yeah. I don't like it, but I'm gonna take it from you. Tell me all about it this time round. Maybe I can treat it with an open mind.
Okay, here goes the part where I tick off the audio files again. In short, I'm still not a fan of DBX noise reduction, and here's why. My biggest complaint, once again, is the overcooked, overprocessed sound. I still feel like, especially at the lower tones, they seem to get badly over-exaggerated. And worse yet, it comes at the expense of the general tonal balance and the depth of sound. Now, I really wish I could get away with posting a couple of complete DBX encoded albums, especially the LPs. And your homework would be to listen to them straight through. And I say this because in little doses, DBX really catches your ear in a good way. And I think that's where a lot of its current cult following comes from. But I find the DBX system causes severe ear fatigue, so much so that I felt like I was having to take the quality of my recording tests on faith after more than an hour of work at a shot. The best way I can describe prolonged exposure to DBX encoding is that it's akin to listening to a modern brick-walled CD, or downloads if you prefer. Everything's right up front and everything just beats you over the head. Now, my other main complaint is that with regards to making your own recordings, DBX is incredibly fussy, fidgety, and all-around needy. Not to mention dealing with the more fussy aspects of your regular tape deck. You have to really enjoy sitting at a tape deck and experimenting a lot. experimenting with peak levels and trying to keep the stereo image accurate. And as I've noticed, sometimes you have to manually play around with the levels on the unit itself, usually during playback, to get the most out of it. And lastly, my smallest complaint is that this is impractical. It's all so dependent on the DBX system. I mean, you have to have a decoder of some sort. To add insult to injury, you can't play your tapes or records on just any old machine, DBX gear or not. It's just not going to fare too well on a cheap setup. If anything, even on the mid and higher end gear, it's still going to be every bit as prone to the differences between everybody's setups. So the playback is always going to be more inconsistent from system to system than it would be with just a standard record or tape. All right, rant over. Well, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I'm forced into an Audio Geek witness protection program because some lunatic hunted me down and carved DBX rules misspelled into my chest using a fresh $1,000 record stylus. Seriously, when did music stop being fun?